They came for her daughters at dawn. The knock on the door wasn't just wood on wood. It was the sound of the world ending. 3 hard cracks so sharp they rattled the glass and shook the dust from the rafters. For a single, stupid heartbeat, Ruth Adler thought it was the storm, a loose shutter finally giving way to the wind. But she knew better. She knew the rhythm of men who believed they owned the world. It was a rhythm that only came in the dark, or in the cold, gray light of morning, when there was no one around to watch. The door groaned open on its own before she could even reach it. The wind was a physical thing, a shove that revealed 2 shapes in the doorway, black against the pale sky. Marshal Reeves stood there, his gloved hand still half raised from the knock. His silver star was a dull spot of gray on his chest, caked with the dust of the road. He looked tired, but it was the kind of tired that made a man dangerous. Behind him, a younger man, Deputy Moline, kept touching the butt of his pistol, his eyes darting around like a nervous bird, wanting something, anything, to go wrong. Ruth moved without thinking, a mother's instinct older than words. She stepped forward, positioning her body to shield the 2 small figures huddled behind her skirts. June, only 10, clutched a fistful of her mother's dress. She was already learning the hard lesson of what fear felt like in your bones. Clara, 2 years younger, was silent. Her tiny hands were balled into fists, her eyes wide and dark in the dim light. "Ruth Adler," the marshal said. His voice had no warmth, no courtesy. It was just a fact. "We're here for the girls." She had practiced hearing that sentence in her head for weeks. She had imagined it whispered, shouted, delivered with pity, but hearing it for real, spoken so plainly, knocked the air from her lungs. It was a punch she couldn't see coming, even though she'd been staring right at it. "You're not taking them," she said. Her own voice was a stranger, a quiet whisper that felt impossibly loud in the suddenly silent room. "Court says otherwise," Reeves replied. He didn't even look at her. He was already reaching inside his long coat, pulling out a folded piece of paper. The wax seal was already broken. "Signed off yesterday. Custody transferred to the state. They'll be sent to Springhold. Fostered separately." Separately. The word was a snake. It slithered into the room and coiled around her heart. Ruth didn't reach for the paper. She didn't need to see the ink. She'd known this was coming, the way a farmer knows a crop is rotten long before he pulls it from the ground. Ever since her husband, Elias, had died under the wheels of that wagon, the world had been closing in. The debts, the whispers, the cold looks in town. A woman alone with 2 daughters wasn't a tragedy to them. It was a problem to be solved, and their solutions never involved kindness. She tried one last time, the words tasting like ash. "Just a little more time. I've applied to teach again. I'm working at the laundry." "You're not making enough," Reeves said flatly. His eyes flickered to the girls behind her. "The state doesn't like to split them up, Ruth. But you and I both know that's what'll happen. There's never enough homes for 2. A small sound escaped her throat. Behind her, June pressed her face hard into her mother's back, her shoulders shaking. Deputy Moline took a step forward, his voice trying for gentle and failing. "Ma'am, don't make this harder than it has to be." "I'm not the one making it hard," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp as broken glass. The fire was back. "I've kept them fed. I've kept them warm. You think some stranger in Springhold is going to do that? You think they'll be safe bouncing from one house to another until they're old enough to be forgotten completely?" Reeves let out a long, weary sigh. "That's not my decision. It's the law." For one wild second, Ruth's hand drifted toward the iron poker resting by the hearth. Not to use it. Not really. Just to feel the solid weight of it in her hand. Just to feel something other than the crushing helplessness. But she dropped her hand just as quickly. She wouldn't scare her girls. She wouldn't give them a memory of their mother turning love into violence. "Can I say goodbye?" she asked. Her voice was hollow, empty. Reeves hesitated. He looked from her to the girls, then back again. Finally, he gave a single, curt nod. "Make it quick." She turned, her body moving like it belonged to someone else. She knelt down, gathering both her daughters into an embrace that felt like it could never be tight enough. June was trying so hard not to cry, her little body rigid with the effort. Clara was already lost in tears, her small sobs muffled against Ruth's shoulder. Ruth kissed their foreheads, their hair, whispering promises she had no idea how to keep. "I'll find you," she whispered, her own tears finally breaking free. "I swear it. No matter where they send you, I'll come for you. I will always come for you." Then she stood up, her chest a cavern of emptiness, and stepped aside. She had lost. But just as the deputy reached for Clara's hand, the wind howled. It slammed the door back against the wall so hard the hinges screamed. And with that gust came another sound. A sound that didn't belong. The slow, rhythmic creak of hooves on the frosted, muddy road. It wasn't a patrol. It wasn't anyone from town. Ruth turned, squinting against the dust and the sudden sharp morning light. And that's when she saw him. A silhouette, black against the rising sun, cresting the small hill near the pine line. One man. One horse. Reeves turned too, his hand instinctively going to his gun. "You expecting someone?" Ruth just shook her head, unable to speak. The rider came on slow, deliberate. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't seem concerned by the two lawmen standing on a widow's porch. His long duster was the color of smoke and thunderclouds, and his hat was pulled low, casting his face in a permanent, unreadable shadow. But there wasn't a soul in Bitter Hollow who wouldn't recognize that shape. Reeves took a half-step back, his face suddenly pale. "John Halt," he muttered, the name a curse on his lips. Even Deputy Mlyn, who'd been so eager for a fight moments ago, flinched. John Halt. A name whispered in taverns and around campfires. A ghost story made of flesh and bone. He hadn't been seen in town for months, not since the shootout over at Dead Creek, where 3 bounty men were found bleeding out in the sand. He didn't live in town. He lived past it, beyond the ridge, beyond the law, beyond reason. Some said he was a killer. Some said he was half mad from loneliness. Most folks just said nothing at all. His horse stopped at the edge of Ruth's small, sad yard. Halt dismounted with the slow, easy grace of a man who feared nothing on God's green earth. He walked forward, his boots making no sound on the soft dirt. His eyes, dark and piercing from under the brim of his hat, locked on the door, on Ruth, and then slid past her to the children. Reeves puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim some shred of authority. "This ain't your business, Halt." John Halt stopped at the bottom step of the porch. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the wind like a razor. "Looks like my business to me." He took another step, his gaze never leaving the marshal. "Then again, if you were done here, you'd already be gone." The silence that followed was so sharp you could cut your hand on it. "You threatening an officer of the law?" Millen stammered, his voice cracking like a boy's. Halt didn't even bother to look at him. His eyes found Ruth's. "You got coffee?" he asked. The question was so insane, so out of place, that for a moment Ruth could only stare. The world was ending. Her daughters were being stolen, and this ghost of a man was asking for coffee. She nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. "Mind if I come in?" It was terrifying. It was madness. But her own voice answered before her brain could catch up, a desperate, drowning sound. "No, I don't mind." And just like that, John Halt stepped up onto the porch. He walked right past Marshal Reeves without a glance, like the man was nothing more than a fence post. Reeves's hand twitched, his fingers hovering over the handle of his gun. But he didn't draw. Not yet. You didn't draw on John Halt unless you planned on dying. Halt walked into her small, broken home and sat down at the kitchen table. He took his hat off, placing it carefully in the center. He looked like he'd been invited for Sunday supper. Like he belonged there. Ruth followed, her hands shaking so badly she could barely stand. She moved to the stove, her body on autopilot, scooping coffee grounds into the pot. Behind her, she heard Reeves clear his throat, his voice louder now, trying to sound official. "This is official business, Halt. I have a court order. You're interfering." John's voice was still quiet, but it filled the small kitchen. "You said yourself, Marshal. The state doesn't like to split 'em up." "That ain't your call to make," Mimlin chirped. John Halt took the steaming mug Ruth placed in front of him. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving Reeves. "Now it is," he said. The silence stretched. Reeves looked from Halt to Ruth to the girls who were now peeking around the doorframe, their tears forgotten, replaced by wide-eyed wonder. The marshal's face was a mask of fury and confusion. He had the law, he had the badge, he had the gun. But John Halt had something else, something colder. Finally, Reeves seemed to make a decision. He spat on the ground. "We'll be back," he growled, "with more men." John smiled. It wasn't a real smile. It was a faint, chilling curve of his lips. "Bring as many as you want." Ruth watched the two lawmen retreat. They didn't run, but they didn't walk either. It was a hurried, backward shuffle, a retreat from something they couldn't understand and didn't dare to fight. When the sound of their horses had faded, the door swung shut, leaving the three of them in a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the shouting had been. Ruth finally found her voice, the question clawing its way up her raw throat. "Why?" she whispered, turning to face the stranger at her table. "Why did you do that?" John Halt didn't look at her. His gaze drifted past her, to the two little girls still hiding in the doorway, to the dying embers in the hearth, to the small, faded photograph of Elias on the mantel. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "Because nobody else did." Outside, the wind howled, carrying the story into town, and just like that, Ruth Adler's quiet, desperate fight had become something else entirely. It had become John Halt's war, and his wars, they said, always ended in blood. Ruth didn't sleep. How could she? John Halt was in her kitchen, asleep in the rickety wooden chair, his hat tilted low over his face. Her daughters were curled on either side of her in the narrow bed, their small bodies pressed against hers as if they could physically hold back the morning. The fire had burned down to a pile of glowing orange coals. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that whistled through the cracks in the walls, sent a jolt of pure terror through her. She kept expecting the door to burst open, to see Reeves and a dozen deputies flooding into her home, guns drawn. But the door remained shut. The only sound was the soft sigh of the wind and the steady, quiet breathing of the man in her kitchen. He hadn't moved all night. He sat with his arms crossed over his chest, chin tucked down. He didn't look peaceful. He just looked still, like a man holding back a hurricane under his skin and refusing, absolutely refusing, to let it break free. When the first hint of gray light touched the frosted window pane, Ruth carefully slipped out of bed, her movements slow and silent so as not to wake the girls. She tiptoed into the kitchen, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. For a long moment she just stood there watching him, this strange, dangerous savior who had appeared out of nowhere. As if he could feel her gaze, his eyes opened. They weren't hazy with sleep. They were sharp, alert, as if he'd never been asleep at all. "You snore," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble in the quiet room. Ruth blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" He stood up, rolling his shoulders with a grimace, like they ached deep in the bone. "The little one, too. Sounds like a freight train heading for a cliff." A flush of indignation crept up her neck. She crossed her arms over her chest. "You're one to talk. You slept with your boots on." "Didn't plan to sleep," he said simply. "Then why did you come here?" The question burst out of her, sharper than she intended. The fear and confusion of the last 24 hours were bubbling over. "No, I really want to know. You ride down from that ridge like some dark, avenging angel. You scare off 2 armed lawmen with a look, and then you just take over my kitchen. Why, Halt?" Why now? He turned to face her fully then. And he didn't just glance at her, he looked at her. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, seemed to see right through the anger, right through the fear, down to the exhausted, terrified woman beneath. The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with unspoken things. "You asked them to wait," he said, his voice softer now. "And nobody listened. That don't sit right with me." "That's not an answer," she shot back. "It's the only one I've got." Before she could press him further, a small creak from the hallway cut her off. June appeared in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from her eyes with a tiny fist. Her other hand was already reaching behind her, searching for her sister. A moment later, Clara stumbled into view, her hair a wild tangle, her voice thick with sleep. "Is he still here?" Clara asked, her eyes wide as she stared at the tall, imposing figure of John Halt. Halt gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Morning." Clara stared at him for a long moment, her head tilted. Then she asked, with the blunt, fearless curiosity of a child, "Do you shoot people?" Ruth gasped. "Clara!" But Halt, he smiled. It was a faint, fleeting thing, like a memory of a smile he'd forgotten how to use. "Not lately," he said. Clara blinked her big, innocent eyes. "Why not?" "Too loud," he replied. "I like the quiet." She nodded solemnly, as if this was the most profound wisdom she had ever heard. Satisfied, she wandered over to the stove to see if there was any oatmeal left, her fear of the strange man completely gone. John's gaze shifted back to Ruth. The ghost of his smile vanished. "You want to tell them what's coming?" he said, his voice flat. "Or should I?" Ruth bristled. "What's coming?" "They'll be back," he said, stating it as a simple, undeniable fact. Reeves isn't the kind of man who lets things go. He sees this as a challenge to his authority now. It's personal. "And what's your plan? You'll just stay here and scare them off again with a look?" she demanded, her voice rising. "If that's what it takes." She studied his face, trying to find a crack in his stone-like composure. "You don't even know us." "I don't need to." "That's not how the world works, Mr. Halt." He took a step closer, his presence seeming to suck all the air out of the room. His voice dropped to a low, intense murmur. "Maybe it should be." That silenced her. What could she say to that? He was right. In a just world, kindness wouldn't require a reason. Protection wouldn't require a formal introduction. Breakfast was a tense, quiet affair. John refused the eggs she offered, but accepted more coffee, drinking it slowly, his eyes constantly flicking towards the window. The girls, however, were no longer afraid. They watched him with a mixture of awe and fascination, whispering to each other behind their hands. For the first time in weeks, they seemed to feel safe. And Ruth hated that she recognized it. She hated that it was this stranger, this dangerous man who was giving them a sense of security that she, their own mother, could no longer provide. After the meager meal, John went outside to check on his horse. Ruth followed him, wrapping her thin shawl tightly around her shoulders against the biting wind. "You don't have to stay," she said, the words feeling flimsy and weak. "I know," he answered without turning around. He ran a hand gently down the horse's neck. "Then why are you?" she pressed, desperation creeping into her voice. He finally turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "You keep asking questions you already know the answers to, Ruth." She opened her mouth to argue, to deny it, but the sound of approaching hooves froze the words in her throat. Her head snapped up. It wasn't just one horse this time. It was two, riding fast, kicking up dust from the road. John's body went rigid. In a single fluid motion, he stepped away from his horse, his hand already reaching for the rifle she hadn't even noticed was strapped to his saddle. "Get inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Take the girls, now." There was no time to argue. The tone of his voice was absolute. Ruth ran, her heart pounding in her ears, calling for the girls. They came immediately, their faces pale with a fear that was becoming far too familiar. She herded them inside and slammed the door shut, peering through the grimy window pane. John hadn't taken cover. He was standing in the middle of the yard, his rifle held loosely at his side, a lone, defiant figure against the vast, empty landscape. The riders slowed as they approached. It was Reeves and Mimlin again. But this time, they looked different. There were no papers, no pretense of politeness. Just hard eyes, grim faces, and the cold, hard glint of lawman's justice carved into their brows. Reeves didn't dismount this time. He pulled his horse to a halt just beyond the broken fence. "You think you're making some kind of point? Halt!" he yelled, his voice carrying on the wind. "All you're doing is delaying the inevitable." John said nothing. He just stood there, as still and silent as a statue. "You threatening me again?" Reeves shouted, his anger growing. "You really want to start something out here that's going to end bloody? Because I promise you, it will." John's voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously calm. "I didn't start anything, Marshal. You're the one who came back." Malin, emboldened by his boss, spat into the dust. "We got 10 deputies back in town, ready to ride. All we gotta do is give the word." "Then give it," John said, his voice flat. Ruth watched from the window, her heart slamming against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could see the white of John's knuckles as he gripped the rifle. She could see the muscle twitching in Reeves's jaw. The marshal was posturing. He was a man of rules and papers, and he didn't want this fight. Not a real one, not here, not against a man like John Halt. Reeves let out a long, slow breath, his bluff called. "You're making a mistake. Halt." John's gaze didn't waver. "You made it first." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. The wind whistled through the pines, the only sound in a world holding its breath. Then, with a curse, Reeves yanked on his horse's reins, turning the animal so sharply it whinnied in protest. Millen hesitated, looking like he wanted to say more, but a single glare from the marshal shut him up. He turned his horse and followed. They rode away without another word, their retreat just as hurried as it had been the day before. Ruth slowly opened the door, her legs feeling weak. "You would have shot him," she whispered, the realization dawning on her. "You really would have shot a marshal." "If he made me," John said, his eyes still fixed on the road where the lawman had disappeared. "That's not how things get fixed," she said, a sob catching in her throat. He finally looked at her, his expression stark and grim. "No," he agreed, "but sometimes it's how they stop getting worse." But things were about to get much, much worse, because the law wasn't the only power in this county. That night, the real trouble came calling. It wasn't a man with a badge. It was a man with a ledger and a cruel smile. A man named Errol Kane. And he didn't just want to take her daughters. He wanted to own them. Word travels fast in a small town, and in Bitter Hollow, it traveled like wildfire on a dry wind. John Halt, the ghost of the ridge, had come down from his mountain. John Halt was standing guard at a widow's door. John Halt had faced down the law twice and won. The whispers changed. Fear turned to fascination. Resentment turned to a grudging respect. But it also drew attention. The kind of attention that buzzards give to a dying animal. There were men in the county who had been waiting for a reason to test their luck against the legend of John Halt. Men who saw weakness not as something to pity, but as something to exploit. The next visitor arrived the following afternoon. He didn't ride a horse. He drove a smart black buggy. He wasn't a lawman. He was worse. He was a man who hid behind the law. Ruth recognized him instantly. Errol Kane. He ran the general store, but his real business was misery. He had ties to the state orphan's office, a man who profited from broken families and misplaced children. He didn't wear a badge because he didn't need one. He wore an expensive suit and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. John met him at the fence line. He didn't say a word, just stood there, a human wall between Kane and the house. "I don't care who you think you are," Kane sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "This isn't your land, and that isn't your family." John's reply was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Kane flinch. "It is now." Kane's greasy smile widened. He looked past John to where Ruth stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around her daughter's. "You're not even married to her. You have no legal standing here. You're just a squatter. A violent squatter, from what I hear." John didn't react, but Ruth felt her breath catch in her throat. The casual cruelty of the man, the way he wielded the law like a club, was terrifying. "Is that what it takes now?" John asked, his voice still unnervingly calm. "A piece of paper and a preacher's blessing to keep a family together?" Kane straightened his perfectly tailored coat, adjusting his cravat. "It takes a father. It takes a provider. Something this poor woman clearly lacks. I am here on behalf of the state. Halt. I have a preliminary order. I'm giving you 3 days to vacate this property and surrender the children to my custody. After that, I'm coming back with a state-sanctioned removal order and enough men to see it enforced. And they won't be as hesitant as Marshal Reeves." 3 days. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ruth didn't speak until the buggy was a black speck disappearing down the road. She couldn't. Her throat was too tight. She stared at John, her eyes wide with a new, colder kind of fear. "You heard him." "I heard him," John confirmed, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. 3 days, John," she said, her voice trembling. "And then what? You'll shoot them all? You'll start a war in my front yard? You can't hold off the whole world forever." "No," he said, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were dark and serious. "You can't hold off the world. That's why we have to change it." "Change it?" she cried, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat. "You can't just change the system. It's too big, too powerful." He looked her dead in the eye, his expression unwavering. "Then we make a new one." It was the statement of a madman. It was impossible. It was insane. And yet, in the 2 days that followed, something impossible began to happen. It started with a knock on the door late that night. Ruth's heart leaped into her throat, thinking Kane had come back early. But when she opened the door, it was Mrs. Wexley, the baker's wife, holding a steaming pot of stew. "You and the little ones need to eat," she said gruffly, thrusting the pot into Ruth's hands before turning and walking away without another word. The next morning, Thomas Parnell, the old blacksmith and a friend of Elias's, appeared with a wagon load of firewood. He stacked it neatly by the porch, gave John a solemn nod, and left. A young boy from a farm on the edge of town, a boy Ruth barely knew, left a basket of fresh eggs on the steps and ran off before anyone could thank him. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't an army. But it was something. It was a small, flickering candle of hope in the suffocating darkness. The town wasn't just watching anymore. It was choosing a side. That night, after the girls were asleep, their bellies full of stew for the first time in weeks, Ruth found John standing by the window, staring out at the dark ridge. "You're not going to stay forever," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he admitted. "Then what are you doing, John? What is all this for?" He was quiet for a long time, the silence stretching between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with a pain he rarely showed. "I buried someone once," he said, his eyes still fixed on the darkness outside. "A long time ago. My sister. She had a husband who was mean, and a spirit that was just tired. Everyone said she was strong. Everyone said she could handle it. They told me not to interfere." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I waited too long to stop listening to them. By the time I rode back for her, it was too late." He finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw not just a killer, not just a ghost, but a man haunted by a failure he could never outrun. "So now," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I don't wait." The air between them crackled with the unspoken truth. This wasn't just about her daughters. It was about his sister. It was about a promise he'd made to a ghost. Ruth looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the legend for the first time. She saw the wound he carried, the loss that drove him. He wasn't a monster. He was a man trying to pay a debt to the dead. She didn't touch him. She didn't offer words of comfort she didn't have. She didn't need to. In that moment of shared silence, an understanding passed between them that was stronger than any promise. He was here to fight a ghost from his past, and she was beginning to realize that she was fighting for a future she hadn't dared to dream of. But Errol Kane was not a ghost. He was a man of flesh and blood and bottomless greed. And their 3 days were almost up. The real storm was about to break. By the second morning of their 3-day reprieve, Ruth woke up to a world that felt fundamentally different. The dread that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by the soft, domestic sounds of life. The scrape of a stool on the wooden floor, a child's quiet humming, the smell of bacon frying. She walked into the kitchen and stopped dead in the doorway. Clara was standing on a stool, a wooden spoon almost as big as she was in her hand, solemnly stirring a pot of oatmeal. John was crouched by the stove, feeding kindling into the fire with the practiced ease of a man who knew his way around a hearth. At the table, June was meticulously braiding a strand of yarn, her brow furrowed in concentration. They looked peaceful, a bizarre makeshift family that had no right to exist. Clara glanced over her shoulder and gave her mother a gap-toothed grin. He said I could help as long as I don't set my dress on fire. John didn't turn around, still waiting to see if she holds up her end of the bargain. A faint smile touched Ruth's lips. She stepped out onto the porch, needing a moment to breathe. The air was cold and crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. She looked out at the town, at the smoke curling from chimneys, at the distant ridge where men like Reeves and Kane were counting down the minutes. 3 days. That's what Kane had given them. 1 day was already gone. She knew what happened when the state got its hands on children. She'd heard the stories. Bureaucrats in dusty offices shuffling papers, their names becoming numbers, their faces forgotten. June would be sent to one family, Clara to another. If they were lucky, they might end up in the same county. But Ruth had stopped believing in luck the day she'd buried Elias. She had been loved once, by a man with kind hands and a laugh that had filled this small house with a light she thought she'd never feel again. But that light had been extinguished under a wagon wheel, and since then, her life had been a long, slow slide into shadow. When she went back inside, a cup of coffee was waiting for her at the table. John had poured it without a word, a silent offering. They ate in a comfortable quiet, punctuated only by the girls' occasional giggles. Ruth watched John, noticing the small things. The way he listened when the girls talked, even when they were babbling nonsense. The way he refilled her coffee cup before it was empty. The way his eyes constantly scanned the windows, a silent sentinel watching for the trouble he knew was coming. After breakfast, he stood up abruptly. "Town's got ears," he said. "I'm gonna go listen to what they're hearing." Ruth nodded, a sudden pang of fear hitting her as she realized how empty and quiet the house would feel with him gone. He saddled his horse and rode off toward town without a backward glance. She tried to keep busy, scrubbing floors that were already clean, mending clothes the girls were about to outgrow. But by noon, the silence was a suffocating weight. Her hands were shaking. If she stayed inside for one more minute, she felt like she would scream. "Come on, girls," she said, her voice overly bright. "Let's go to town." She hitched up the old rickety cart, her hands fumbling with the worn leather straps. Let them see her. Let the town see that Ruth Adler wasn't hiding. Let Errol Kane see that she still had some fight left in her. The main street of Bitter Hollow was quiet. As she drove the cart past the blacksmith's shop, old Parnell looked up from his anvil and raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Mrs. Lockley, the preacher's wife, peered out from behind the lace curtains of the bakery. When she reached the general store, her heart plummeted. Errol Kane was standing on the porch. He wasn't alone. He was talking to 2 other men Ruth didn't recognize. They wore clean coats and stiff hats. They had the hard, impatient look of outsiders. Her first instinct was to keep going, to click the reins and get her girls away from there. But just as she was about to, Clara's small voice piped up. "Mama, can we get a licorice whip?" Ruth hesitated. It was a stupid, childish request, but in that moment, running felt like surrender. Before she could change her mind, she was climbing down from the cart, her movements stiff. She lifted the girls out, her arms feeling strangely weak. Kane's eyes locked on her as she approached. Well, brave of you to show your face, Mrs. Adler." "Just doing some shopping," she said, her voice miraculously even. "For now," he said with a smug smile. He nodded toward the two strangers. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Dugan and Mr. Price. They're supervisors from the state office. They have the proper paperwork in hand, all legal and binding." The taller of the two men, Price, gave her a cold, dismissive nod. "We'll be back for the children tomorrow morning, ma'am. That clock doesn't stop ticking just because you get sentimental." Ruth's spine went rigid. "They are not objects for you to collect." "No, ma'am," Price replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. "They're wards of the state. There's a big difference." She didn't dignify that with a response. She pushed past them, her hands gripping her daughter's shoulders, and walked into the store. The familiar smell of flour, leather, and tobacco was strangely comforting. Mr. Harlan, the clerk, gave her a sympathetic nod and began bagging her usual order of flour and beans. As she fumbled in her purse for a few worn coins, a voice from the doorway cut through the quiet murmur of the store, a voice that was low, measured, and sent a shiver of ice down her spine. "Looks like you're short by a day, Kane." John Holt stepped into the general store, and the entire room seemed to go still. His presence filled the space, dark and heavy like a gathering storm. Everyone froze. Even Kane's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. John's gaze settled on the two state men. "I don't recall seeing any badges." Dugan puffed out his chest. "We don't need badges. We have a state order." "And tomorrow you'll be on private land," John cut in, his voice dangerously soft. "If you step 1 foot past that woman's gate without the marshal present, that's trespassing, and I tend to take a dim view of trespassers." Price took a step forward, trying to assert his authority. "We have state authorization to bypass local law enforcement in these matters." "Then you'd better come back with the circuit judge," John countered smoothly, "because I'd love to hear what he thinks of you men trying to circumvent his authority. I'm sure he'd be fascinated." The silence was thick with tension. The two state men exchanged an uneasy glance. They were bureaucrats, men of paper and ink. They weren't prepared for this. Then Kane let out a short, bitter laugh. "You think you can win this with a stare-down, Halt? This isn't some back-alley saloon brawl. This is the law. You can't shoot paperwork." A ghost of a smile touched John's lips. "I don't need to." That night, the whispers in town turned into a low roar. Lines were being drawn. Sides were being chosen. Ruth tucked the girls into bed at Mrs. Lockley's house, then went outside to the woodpile. She grabbed the axe and began to chop, swinging it with a desperate, furious energy, as if she could split the fear and rage inside her. John came out and quietly took the axe from her hands. "I'm not helpless," she said, her voice ragged and breathless. "Didn't say you were," he replied, and split a log with one clean, effortless swing. She crossed her arms, shivering in the cold night air. "You're not going to be able to stop this. You know that, don't you? They'll just come back with more papers, more men." He paused, resting the axe head on the chopping block. He looked up at her, his eyes catching the faint moonlight. "Maybe not, but we're going to make damn sure they remember it." And somehow, that felt like something. It wasn't a promise of victory. It wasn't an assurance of safety. But it was a promise of defiance. It was a promise of a fight. The next morning brought a thin, early snow, a dusting of white that muffled the world in an expectant silence. And down the snow-covered road they came. It wasn't just two men this time. It was an army. Marshal Reeves was at the head, his face grim. He was flanked by two deputies Ruth didn't recognize. Behind them were the two state men, Dugan and Price. And leading them all, riding at the very front like a conquering general, was Errol Kane. This was it, the final stand. Ruth stood in the doorway of her small, broken-down house. Her daughters were behind her, their small hands clutching her skirt. And at her side, solid as the mountain he came from, stood John Halt. Reeves dismounted, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "This isn't about sides anymore, Ruth," he called out. "This is about the law." John took a step forward, his voice ringing out in the cold, clear air. "Law without mercy isn't justice, Marshal. It's just control." "Don't you talk to me about mercy," Reeves snapped, his face flushed with anger. "You've killed men for less than this." "Then maybe I'm trying something different," John replied. Reeves ignored him, his gaze fixed on Ruth. "You can end this right now. No more trouble. Let the girls go. They'll be placed in good homes. Separated, maybe, but they'll be safe." Ruth's voice cracked, but her words were clear and strong. "They're already in a good home." Kane strode forward, brandishing the official-looking document like a sword. "This is your final warning. If you do not comply, we are authorized to use any means necessary." John raised his rifle. He didn't aim it. He just held it. Ready. Reeves drew a sharp breath through his teeth. "You really want to die for this, Halt?" "No," John said, his voice quiet but carrying across the snow-covered yard. "But I'm willing to live for it." And just as the deputies began to move forward, a new sound filled the air. The crunch of boots on snow, the creak of wagon wheels. From the road, a line of figures appeared. Old Man Parnell, the blacksmith, holding a heavy hammer in his hand. Mrs. Lockley, clutching her Bible to her chest. Mr. Harlan from the store, the young boy who had brought the eggs. One by one, the townspeople of Bitter Hollow emerged from the morning mist. They didn't say a word. They just walked into Ruth's yard and stood behind her, behind John. A silent, defiant line stretching from one side of the property to the other. They didn't have guns. They didn't have badges. But they had something more powerful. They had chosen a side. Reeves stared at the silent crowd, his jaw tight with fury. He looked at Kane, at his deputies, at the unmovable figure of John Halt. "You're all making a big mistake," he snarled. "Then let history be the judge of that," John replied. For a long, agonizing moment, the world held its breath. Then, with a curt, angry nod, Reeves turned his horse. "Let's go." His deputies and the two state men hesitated, but they followed his lead, turning their backs on the silent rebellion. As they rode away, a collective sigh of relief went through the crowd. Ruth felt her knees go weak. The girls clung to her, their faces buried in her dress. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because not everyone had left. Errol Kane was still there. He stood alone in the middle of the road, his face a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. He stared at Ruth, at John, at the crowd of neighbors who had defied him. A slow, dangerous smile curled his lips. "This isn't over," he hissed. And with that final, venomous promise, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the falling snow. Ruth looked at John, and for the first time since he had arrived, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. He looked afraid. The victory felt like ash in her mouth. The townspeople had dispersed, their quiet courage leaving a warmth in the cold air, but it wasn't enough. The law had retreated, but Kane had not. His parting words, "This isn't over," echoed in the silence, a promise far more terrifying than any court order. That night, the sky pressed down, a heavy starless lid. Ruth sat in the rocking chair by the hearth, the rhythmic creak of the wood the only sound in the house. June and Clara were asleep on the braided rug at her feet, a tangle of limbs and quilts. They looked so small, so fragile. Across the room, John sat with his back to the wall, his rifle resting across his knees. He hadn't moved in hours. His eyes, even in the dim, flickering light of the fire, were sharp and restless. "He's not done," Ruth said, breaking the long silence. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "I know," John replied without looking at her. "Do you think he would—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She couldn't give voice to the dark fear that was clawing at her insides. John's gaze flickered to the sleeping girls, then back to the fire. I think Errol Kane is the kind of man who hates losing more than he loves the law, more than he loves anything. So yes, I think he'll come back. Her fingers tightened around the cold ceramic of her coffee mug. And then what, John? Another standoff? Another fight? When does it end? His jaw muscle ticked. Just once. It ends when we make it end. But Ruth was so tired of fighting. She wanted peace. She wanted to be able to promise her daughters a tomorrow that wasn't filled with fear and uncertainty. But peace was a luxury she couldn't afford. It had to be earned. It had to be won. The town had changed. The lines that had been drawn in the snow were now carved in stone. Some neighbors, emboldened by the standoff, would nod to her in the street. Others would look away, their faces a mixture of guilt and resentment. She was no longer just a widow to be pitied. She was a disruption, a problem that wouldn't go away. The next morning was Sunday. John walked beside her and the girls as they made their way to the small clapboard chapel. When they sat in the back pew, the preacher, a kind-faced man named Miles, skipped his usual sermon. Instead, he invited the congregation to share their prayers. The blacksmith, Thomas Parnell, stood up slowly. "I pray," he said, his voice a low rumble, "for wisdom in the face of men who confuse cruelty with righteousness." Mrs. Lockley, leaning heavily on her cane, rose next. "I pray that children will never again be treated as property to be seized." Then, to her own surprise, Ruth found herself standing. Her voice didn't tremble. It was clear and strong. "I pray," she said, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her neighbors, "that fear doesn't win. Not in my home, not in this town, not while my daughters are still watching." A profound silence filled the chapel. John didn't say a word on the way home, but as they reached the cabin, he paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. "They'll come at night," he said, his voice grim. "Kane won't risk another public confrontation." "I know," Ruth replied, her heart sinking. "We need to be ready." The afternoon was a blur of frantic preparation. Ruth packed what little food they had into a sack, gathered blankets, and stashed a few precious belongings in the root cellar. John moved through the house like a wraith, boarding up the back windows, reinforcing the front door with an iron bar, and stretching a thin wire between two trees on the path leading to the house, a makeshift tripwire. He worked with a grim, silent efficiency that told her he had done this before. He knew what shape danger took when it came for you in the dark. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Ruth sat her daughters down. She told them stories, not of brave knights and princesses, but of clever girls who outsmarted hungry wolves, of sisters who found their way back to each other through dark and treacherous forests. They listened, their small faces serious, as if they understood that these weren't just stories. They were lessons. They were weapons. Then the sun dipped below the ridge, and the waiting began. The silence was a physical thing, pressing in on them, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Ruth stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the darkening woods. John sat by the door, rifle in hand, his breathing slow and steady. It started with a single gunshot, far off in the distance, a warning, then another, closer this time. "They're testing us," John murmured, his voice a low growl, "trying to draw us out." He was right. There was no sound of horses, just the faint crunch of boots on frozen ground, the snap of a twig in the woods. They were coming on foot, trying to be quiet. John stood up, his movements fluid and silent. He motioned for Ruth and the girls to move to the back room. "Stay low, don't make a sound," Clara whimpered, her small hand grabbing the back of his coat. "Don't let them take us." He knelt down, his face level with hers. For a moment, the hard lines of his face softened. "Not while I'm breathing," he promised. The front door shuddered under a heavy blow. Then again, a voice called out from the darkness, thick with malice. It was Kane. "Adler, we gave you a chance! We offered you a peaceful solution. You offered threats wrapped in polite words, John yelled back. We declined! A third blow, heavier this time, splintered the wood of the door. Ruth pulled the girls to the floor, shielding them with her own body. The door burst open, crashing against the inner wall. But it wasn't Kane who stepped through the shattered doorway. It was Duggan, one of the statemen. He was alone, his face pale and slick with sweat. He held up his hands, his eyes wide with fear. Wait, don't shoot, he stammered. John's aim didn't waver. You're not welcome here. I know, Duggan gasped, taking a shaky step into the room. I didn't come for the children. I came to warn you. John frowned. Warn us about what? It's not just about a court order anymore, Duggan said, his words tumbling out in a rush. Kane paid off a clerk in the county records office. He has a falsified seizure notice, not for the girls, but for the whole property. He's going to claim you defaulted on a debt you never had. And if you resist, he has men with him, hired guns, ready to swear you fired first. He's planning to kill you both tonight and make it look legal. John slowly lowered his rifle. Why are you telling us this? Duggan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Because I have a daughter, and I've seen what happens to children who fall into the hands of men like Kane. I signed up to help kids, not to get them orphaned. I won't be a part of that. Ruth scrambled to her feet. So what do we do? John's eyes were already scanning the dark woods through the broken doorway. We move. Where can we go? She cried. He'll have men watching the roads. We're not taking the roads, John said, his gaze shifting to the dark, ominous ridge that loomed behind the cabin. We're going to the one place in this county that Kane won't dare to follow. Ruth's heart stopped. She knew what he meant. The old silver mines. They had been abandoned for years, the shafts deemed too unstable, too dangerous. They were a place of ghosts and shadows, a place where men had been lost and never found. But they were also beyond the county line, beyond Kane's jurisdiction. They had no choice. They bundled the girls in blankets, grabbed the sack of food, and slipped out the back window. Duggan promised to create a diversion, to buy them some time. Whether he was telling the truth, they didn't know. The snow was falling again, a soft, silent curtain that covered their tracks, almost as soon as they made them. The climb up the ridge was treacherous in the dark, the rocks slick with ice. The girls didn't cry. They just held tight to Ruth's hands, their small faces pale in the moonlight. The entrance to the mine was a black, gaping maw in the side of the mountain, like the mouth of some dead god. John pried away the old, rotting boards that covered the entrance. I'll go first, he said, his voice low. Step exactly where I step. Keep one hand on the wall at all times. Ruth nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took June's hand, and June took Clara's, a small human chain against the overwhelming darkness. And one by one, they stepped out of the world and into the cold, silent belly of the earth. The darkness was absolute. The silence was so profound it was a sound in itself. Ruth couldn't see her own feet. She could only hear the shuffle of John's boots ahead of her and feel the cold, damp stone under her fingertips. They walked for what felt like an eternity, deeper and deeper into the mountain. Finally, John stopped. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light blindingly bright. They were in a small, dry chamber off the main tunnel. Old, dusty supplies were scattered around, a rusted pickaxe, a few empty cans, the tattered remains of a bedroll. Someone had hidden here before. Ruth collapsed onto the dusty floor, pulling the girls into her arms. John built a tiny fire in a ring of stones, the flames dancing and casting long, flickering shadows on the rock walls. For a moment, a fragile sense of safety settled over them. But just as she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, John's head snapped up. His whole body went tense. And then she heard it too. A sound from the tunnel. Faint, but unmistakable. The crunch of boots on loose gravel. Someone had followed them into the dark. The sound echoed in the narrow tunnel, each footstep a sharp, distinct crack in the profound silence. It wasn't the clumsy stumbling of a search party. It was the deliberate, confident tread of a single man who knew exactly where he was going. The tiny fire John had built, a beacon of warmth and hope moments before, now seemed like a terrible mistake. It was a spotlight, a declaration of their presence in the suffocating dark. In one swift, silent motion, John kicked dirt over the flames, plunging them back into absolute blackness. The darkness was a living thing. It pressed in on Ruth, cold and heavy. John's hand found hers, his grip firm and steadying. He squeezed it once, then guided her and the girls against the far wall of the chamber, pressing them down into a low crouch. The girls obeyed without a sound, their small bodies trembling against hers. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Still just one man. There was no shouting, no clatter of equipment. Whoever was coming alone, and he was coming for them. The steps stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. It stretched on, second after agonizing second. Ruth held her breath, straining to hear anything, the scrape of a boot, the rustle of clothing, the sound of breathing. But the mind swallowed every sound. Was he listening for them? Had he lost their trail? Or was he standing just around the bend in the tunnel, a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake? Then a voice cut through the darkness. It was soft, almost conversational, and that made it even more chilling. "I know you're in there, Halt." It wasn't Kane's voice. It wasn't Dugan's. It was someone new. "I ain't here to hurt nobody," the voice continued, echoing slightly off the rock walls. "And I sure as hell ain't here to take those kids. I just want to talk." John didn't move a muscle. Ruth could feel the tension radiating from him, a low, dangerous hum. "My name's Ellis," the voice said. "Ellis Mears. I used to work these tunnels, back before the silver ran out. Used to drink with your husband sometimes, Mrs. Adler. He was a good man, always paid his debts." Ruth stiffened. "Elias? This man knew Elias?" "I got no quarrel with you folks," Ellis continued. "But Kane, he offered me a pocketful of coin to come in here and flush you out. Said you were holed up with a killer, and he was worried for the children's safety." A dry, humorless chuckle echoed in the tunnel. "But I've seen what Errol Kane does to folks he's worried about, and I don't want that kind of weight on my soul. Not for a handful of silver." Slowly, silently, John rose to his feet. He stepped forward, a dark silhouette against the fainter darkness of the tunnel entrance. "You walk away now, Ellis," John said, his voice a low growl. "You walk away and you tell Kane you found nothing but bats and ghosts. You keep that soul of yours clean." There was a pause. Then, "That's what I was hoping you'd say. But you need to know Halt. He ain't giving up. This ain't about the kids anymore. It's about pride. He's calling in favors from every corner of the county, judges, deputies from other towns, anyone who owes him a marker. He's going to bury you." Then came the sound of retreating footsteps, fading slowly back down the tunnel until they were gone. When the last echo had died, Ruth let out a shaky breath, her knees buckling. The girls sagged against her, their small bodies limp with relief. But John didn't relax. His knife, which she hadn't even seen him draw, was still clutched in his hand. "He was telling the truth," Ruth whispered. "Maybe," John said, his eyes still scanning the darkness. "Or maybe he was just the scout. Kane's not a man who sends one dog when a pack will do. The next time, it won't be a conversation." "So what do we do?" she cried, her voice cracking. The brief flicker of hope was already gone, replaced by a cold, hard despair. "We can't stay in this mine forever. We can't run forever. We're not criminals, John. We're just trying to live," he finished for her. His eyes met hers in the darkness, and in them she saw a reflection of her own exhaustion, her own fear. They both knew it. Running was no longer an option. Hiding was no longer an option. The game had changed. It had never been about her daughters, not really. It had been about power. It had been about making an example of her. Kane couldn't afford to look weak, and Ruth Adler, a penniless widow, had made him look like a fool. They stayed in the mine for one more night, the cold seeping deep into their bones. By the time the first faint rays of dawn pierced the darkness of the tunnel entrance, Ruth had made a decision. A terrifying, reckless decision. They were going back, not to the cabin to hide, not to the next town to run. They were going back to Bitter Hollow, back to the heart of the beast. "It's a trap," John argued, his voice harsh. "You walk into that courthouse and Kane will have you arrested before you can say a word. He'll bury you in so much red tape you'll suffocate." "He wants us to be afraid," Ruth said, her voice filled with a new, steely resolve she didn't know she possessed. "He expects us to run, so we're going to do the one thing he won't expect. We're going to walk right up to him and defy him." She stood up, brushing the dust from her dress. "You said it yourself, John, he needs power, and power comes from people believing you have it. If we show the town that we're not afraid, if we stand up to him in broad daylight, maybe, just maybe, someone with real power will finally start to listen." John watched her for a long, silent moment. A strange expression crossed his face, a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met," he said slowly, "or the biggest fool." "I'm a mother," she replied quietly. "Sometimes that's the same thing." They walked into town late that morning. The snow had stopped, and the sky was a pale, washed-out blue. As they walked down the main street, heads turned, doors creaked open, whispers followed them like a trail of smoke. Ruth walked in front, her head held high, a daughter's hand in each of hers. John walked a few paces behind, a silent, deadly shadow. As they reached the courthouse, Clara looked up at her, her eyes wide with fear. "Mama, are we going to jail?" Ruth knelt down and looked her daughter in the eye. "No, sweet girl," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We're going to tell the truth, and today, the truth is going to be loud." When they walked through the courthouse doors, Errol Kane was already there, standing by the clerk's desk, a smug, triumphant look on his face. When he saw them, his expression shifted from surprise to pure, unadulterated fury. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he sneered. Ruth stopped 10 feet away from him, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "We're not running anymore, Mr. Kane." "You're trespassing on county property," he snarled. "No," John cut in, his voice ringing through the cavernous room. "We're here to file a claim." Kane blinked, momentarily confused. "A claim for what?" John stepped forward and dropped a thick packet of papers onto the clerk's desk. "This," he announced, his voice booming, "is a notarized affidavit from one Ellis Mears, testifying that you, Errol Kane, offered him payment to illegally intimidate and remove citizens from their refuge, a clear violation of County Code Section 14C. The clerk's eyes went wide. "Furthermore," John continued, producing another document, "these are sworn statements from Mrs. Wexley, Mr. Thomas Parnell, and the Reverend Miles, all testifying to a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of your position." Kane's face went pale. This is ridiculous. You think you can stop me with a few pieces of paper filled with lies?" "I think," Ruth said, stepping up to the desk, her voice ringing with newfound strength, "that you made one mistake too many. You didn't just come after me. You came after my daughters. And in doing so, you came after this whole town." As if on cue, the courthouse doors swung open. 3 men entered. The first was Deputy Hart, his face grim and determined. The second was Reverend Miles, and the third was a tall, stern-faced man in a black coat whom Ruth didn't recognize until John whispered, "The circuit judge." Kane spun around, his face a mask of disbelief. "What in the hell is this?" The judge held up a hand, silencing him. "This, Mr. Kane, is an official inquiry. Based on some very disturbing reports that have reached my desk, you will stand down and cease all actions against Mrs. Adler and her children, pending a full investigation." "You have no right," Kane sputtered. "I have every right," the judge snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "And if you continue to obstruct this proceeding, I will have you removed in irons." For one terrifying moment, it looked like Kane might actually lunge at the judge. His fists were clenched, his body coiled like a snake. His wild eyes darted from Ruth to John to the judge. Then, with a strangled cry of rage, he threw his own packet of papers to the floor, turned, and stormed out of the courthouse, slamming the door so hard the entire building seemed to shake. The relief didn't come in a sudden wave. It seeped in slowly, cautiously. The judge spent the rest of the day reviewing documents, taking testimony, his face a grim, unreadable mask. By sunset, he had issued a temporary ruling. Errol Kane was suspended from all official duties, pending a formal hearing. It wasn't a final victory. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a start. As they stepped out into the twilight, the town square was abuzz with whispers. Mrs. Lockley appeared at Ruth's side, pressing a warm, cloth-wrapped parcel into her hands. "Bread," she said simply. "For the girls." The blacksmith tipped his hat. The schoolteacher smiled. Small gestures, quiet things, but they meant everything. John stood off to the side, watching, a man who didn't know how to step into the light. Ruth walked over to him. "You don't have to go," she said softly. He looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Wasn't planning on it." "I don't just mean tonight," she clarified. "I mean, after, when this is all over. You don't have to go." He looked from her face to the girls chasing fireflies in the square, to the town that was slowly, cautiously coming back to life. A flicker of something she couldn't name passed through his eyes. "We'll see," he said. But it wasn't the words that mattered. It was the way he said them. Not a promise, but the beginning of one. The foundation of a future she had never dared to imagine. But the foundation was about to be shaken to its very core. Because Errol Kane was a man who didn't accept defeat. And he was about to prove that if he couldn't win by the law, he would win by breaking it in the most brutal way imaginable. The quiet that followed the judge's ruling was deceptive. It felt like peace, but it was just the deep breath a storm takes before it unleashes its full fury. For a few days, Bitter Hollow felt like a different town. People looked Ruth in the eye. They smiled. Kane was gone, a phantom banished by the light of the law. The temporary order felt permanent. It felt like victory. But John Holt knew better. He never relaxed. He stayed at the boarding house Mrs. Lockley had opened to them, but he didn't sleep in the bed. He sat in a chair by the window, his rifle never far from his hand, his eyes constantly scanning the dark streets. He saw the shadows that others missed. He heard the whispers the wind carried from other towns. Kane had been shamed, and a man like Kane doesn't just walk away from shame. He lets it fester. He lets it curdle into vengeance. The first sign of trouble came not with a bang, but with the clatter of horseshoes. 3 riders trotted into town, their faces hard and unfamiliar. They didn't stop at the saloon. They went straight to the old post office where Kane still kept a private office. Deputy Hart, a good man who had been a quiet ally, found Ruth in the street. "It's not just Kane anymore," he said, his voice low and worried. "He's called in his markers. 2 big landholders from Blue Hollow and a wealthy merchant from Mayberry. They're filing counterclaims. They're saying you're an unfit mother, that Holt is a dangerous influence. They're burying the judge in paperwork, trying to force a delay." "Delay for what?" Ruth asked, her blood running cold. "Time," John said, appearing beside them like a shadow. "They're buying time for Kane to regain his leverage, or to find another way." The judge was on his circuit 2 towns away. The new hearing was scheduled for the following week. A week was a lifetime. That night, John received a folded piece of paper from a boy at the telegraph station. It was a message from Ellis Mears, the miner. He had heard of another woman, a widow named Beatrice Ashby, from a neighboring county. 2 years ago, Kane had used the same tactics on her, seizing her land and having her son taken by the state under the guise of concern. Ellis had found her, and she was willing to talk. It was a thread of hope, a fragile one, but it was something to hold on to. The next few days were a desperate race against time. Ruth, armed with this new information, went from house to house, from shop to shop. She didn't plead, she didn't beg, she just told her story, and she told Beatrice Ashby's story. John stood behind her, a silent testament to the truth of her words. The tide of public opinion, which had started to waver, began to turn back in her favor. The day of the hearing arrived. The courthouse was packed, the air thick with tension. Kane was there, flanked by his powerful friends, his face a mask of calm confidence. He looked like a man who had already won. His lawyers presented their case, a mountain of carefully worded documents and false testimonies, painting Ruth as a neglectful, unstable woman, and John as a violent drifter who had taken her hostage. Then it was Ruth's turn. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. But before she could speak, a voice from the back of the courtroom called out, "I have something to say." A woman with a tired face and a pronounced limp made her way to the front, leaning heavily on a cane. It was Beatrice Ashby. 2 years ago, she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, Mr. Kane expressed his concern for me and my son. He coerced me into signing over the deed to my land. He had my boy taken away. I was too broken to fight back then, but I'm not broken anymore. A murmur went through the crowd. Kane shot to his feet, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is hearsay! This woman has no standing here!" "Sit down, Mr. Kane," the judge commanded, his voice like thunder. Then Mrs. Lockley stood up, then the blacksmith, then Deputy Hart, presenting official reports of Kane's abuses of power that had been previously ignored. And finally, John Holt stepped forward. He didn't speak of the law. He spoke of what he had seen, a mother's love, a child's fear, a man's greed. His words were simple, stark, and powerful. When it was over, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. The judge looked at Kane, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "All claims against Mrs. Adler are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, this court is opening a formal investigation into the business dealings of Mr. Errol Kane. Effective immediately, he is barred from filing any further guardianship claims in this district." A cheer erupted in the courtroom. It was over. They had won. Kane didn't say a word. He just turned, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was terrifying, and stalked out of the room. The next few days felt like a dream. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief. The children started playing in the streets again. John fixed the broken steps on the boarding house porch. Ruth started teaching a sewing class for the local girls. It was a fragile, tentative piece, but it felt real. One evening, Ruth and John sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The girls were chasing moths in the yard, their laughter echoing in the twilight. "You'll be leaving soon," Ruth said softly. It wasn't a question. "You were never meant to stay in one place. You have the road in your soul. I've always seen it." He didn't answer right away. He just watched the girls, a strange, soft expression on his face. "I'm not sure where else I'd go," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, unfinished, but full of a meaning that went deeper than words. A future was beginning to take shape, one built not on fear, but on something else, something quiet and strong. Then, from the road, came the thunder of a single horse, ridden hard. A young boy, no older than 16, skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust, waving a telegram. "Urgent message for Mrs. Adler," he panted. Ruth's heart seized. She stepped off the porch, her hands trembling as she took the small envelope. She tore it open. The message was a single, chilling line. "He's not done. Watch the girl. The girl. Which girl?" Her head snapped up, her eyes frantically searching the yard. Clara was standing by the gate, her face pale. But June was gone. She didn't remember screaming, but her throat was raw. The world dissolved into a blur of motion. John was a dark streak, leaping off the porch and sprinting across the yard toward the trees at the edge of the property. Ruth was right behind him, her lungs on fire, her mind a vortex of pure, primal terror. June had been right there, spinning in circles, her blue ribbon flying in the dusk. And now she was gone, not wandered off, not hiding. Gone. John reached the woods first. The boy who had delivered the telegram was frozen in place, his face white with shock. "Who gave you this?" John barked, his voice a low, terrifying growl. A man," the boy stammered. "Tall, with a scar on his temple. He gave me $1 and told me to run fast. He said you'd know what it meant." John didn't need to hear any more. He plunged into the trees, disappearing into the deepening shadows. They found the blue ribbon first, snagged on the thorny branch of a hawthorn bush. Then a single small footprint, pressed deep into the mud by the creek bed. "She was carried," John said, his voice tight, his eyes scanning the ground like a predator. "She struggled. See here? Broken branches, a heel drag. Is she... How do we know we're not too late?" Ruth rasped, the words tearing at her throat. He met her eyes, his own gaze blazing with a cold fire. "Because if he just wanted her dead, he wouldn't have sent the warning. This is a message. He wants us to come." They moved faster then, deeper into the woods. The fear that gripped Ruth was a new and terrible thing. It was a mother's fear, a fear not just for her child's life, but for her soul. Then they heard it. A small, defiant voice cracked with fear but clear. "Let me go!" They plunged toward the sound. The woods opened into a small, secluded clearing. A small fire crackled, and beside it sat a man with his back to them, and held in front of him, a small, struggling shield, was June. "I knew you'd come," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He turned his head, and Ruth's blood ran cold. She recognized the scar on his temple. Tiller Cray, a former deputy of Kane's, a cruel, violent man who had vanished years ago after a botched ambush. Everyone thought he was dead. "Let her go, Tiller," John said, his voice dangerously calm. Tiller's lips curled into a hideous grin. He stroked June's hair with a grimy hand. "She's a pretty little thing, just like her mama. I think breaking her might just break you in all the ways that Kane never could." John moved. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a blur of pure, righteous fury. Tiller tried to react, to use June as a shield, but he was too slow. Ruth lunged forward, catching her daughter as John slammed into Tiller, the two men crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Ruth didn't wait to see the outcome. She grabbed June and ran, stumbling through the dark woods, the sounds of the brutal fight fading behind her. She ran until her lungs gave out, until her legs wouldn't carry her another step. A few moments later, John emerged from the trees, his face bruised and bleeding, but his eyes clear. "He's not dead," he said, his chest heaving. "But he won't be getting up any time soon." Ruth could only nod, clutching June so tightly the child could barely breathe. But it wasn't over. This was just the opening act. Kane had escalated the war from the courtroom to the wilderness. And the final battle was still to come. When they returned to town, broken and bleeding but with June safe, the final confrontation erupted. Kane was waiting in the town square. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by 2 hired guns, men with cold eyes and hands that rested too close to their pistols. And he had new papers. Fraudulent warrants from a corrupt judge in another county, calling for the immediate arrest of John Halt for attempted murder and Ruth Adler as his accomplice. "It's over, Halt," Kane sneered. "You can't fight the law." "That's not the law," John said, stepping forward. "That's just paper with your lies written on it. The hired guns went for their weapons. They weren't fast enough." John moved with a speed that was terrifying to behold. There were no gunshots, just the sickening crunch of bone as he disabled both men with a series of brutally efficient blows. They were on the ground, groaning in the dirt, before their guns had even cleared their holsters. Kane stared, his face a mask of disbelief. He was alone. His money, his power, his hired muscle, it had all failed him. Then Ruth stepped forward. She held up the knife they had found on Tiller Cray. "Was this your plan, Errol? To kidnap my child, to terrorize my family, to burn down everything I have? No judge cares about a penniless widow and her brat," he spat, his voice cracking with desperation. The sound of the slap echoed through the silent square. Ruth stood before him, her hand still raised, her eyes blazing with a fire that had been forged in fear and loss. "Maybe the judge doesn't," she said, her voice shaking with rage, "but this town does." And behind her, the town stood. The blacksmith, the baker, the preacher, Deputy Hart. One by one they stepped forward, forming a silent, human wall between Cain and the family he had tried to destroy. Cain looked at the ring of determined faces. He looked at the two men writhing on the ground. He looked at John Halt, who stood ready to finish what he had started. And for the first time, Errol Cain looked truly, utterly defeated. He turned and walked away. He didn't run. He didn't look back. He just walked out of town, a man broken by the very people he had tried to break. And this time, they all knew he wasn't coming back. The days that followed were not filled with grand celebrations, but with small, quiet acts of healing. John's name was officially cleared. Deputy Hart was made the new interim sheriff, and the court granted Ruth full and undisputed custody of her daughters, her home, and her future. She was no longer the widow to be pitied or scorned. She was Ruth Adler, the woman who had faced down the darkness and won. And John Halt, the ghost of the ridge, didn't leave. He stayed. He mended fences. He taught June how to whittle a bird from a piece of scrap wood. He sat with Ruth on the porch at dusk, the two of them often saying nothing at all, because the most important things were already understood. The following spring, under the shade of the big oak tree behind the church, they were married. Clara wore a crown of wildflowers in her hair. June cried, not from sadness, but from a happiness so big her small heart couldn't contain it. They were a strange, cobbled-together family, born from violence and fear. A broken woman, two lost girls, and a man who had forgotten how to live. But together, they were whole. And for the first time in a very long time, for all of them, that was more than enough. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of justice, survival, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to be broken. Thanks for watching.